Despite Earth's massive population growth, there are still some relatively untouched and remote places in the world that would be quite a chore to get to. Join us as we have a look at some of the most bizarre, isolated places in the world. Now, can you imagine walking 2 hours and then scaling a cliff all in order just to get to your day job? Well, that's what an Ethiopian priest who rises early in the morning has to do every day. Every day he walks 2 hours to the bottom of a cliff and then climbs straight up barefoot with no ropes. And his reward? Well, being able to access his church, which is carved into the cliff. The church comes complete with a 250-meter drop, and the priest spends his whole day studying ancient texts, all before locking up and then scaling back down the cliff. Now, you may be asking yourself, why doesn't he just take another way? Well, that's because scaling the cliff is the only way in order to get there. And it makes it just one of the bizarre isolated places that we're looking at today. In China lies one of the most isolated counties in the world, Mouto. Mouto is completely inaccessible by road. Now, don't get me wrong, they did try back in 1993 to build a highway, but it only worked for about 2 days, because only 4 cars got the privilege of driving down the road, one of which ended up getting stuck. Soon after, the road was then swallowed up by the jungle, and all that remains is a 200-meter-long suspension cable that's 100 meters above the ground. And now it's the only way to access the county. All supplies and food have to be brought in on foot. And the question is, why would you want to live there? 500 miles below the North Pole lies the most northern permanently inhabited village, the village of Uluru, which only has a population of 5 people. Is that even considered a population? It's more like a family that took over a small area. Temperatures in Uluru can reach negative 40 degrees below zero, but that's to be expected when you're the closest neighbor to the North Pole. La Raconda, Peru is the highest city in the world, sitting on top of a permanently frozen glacier. The only way to get into this city is by truck, but it better be 4-wheel drive. Despite the conditions, La Raconda is home to more than 30,000 people. And what are they all doing living on the ice? Well, they're in the gold business. And I guess when there's gold at stake, you'll live anywhere. Even if it also means that you live without a sewage system, no running water, no sanitation, and no paved roads. However, they do have electricity, which is a small luxury compared to the lack of sanitation and loads of garbage everywhere. Next, we make our way to the outback, to Cape York Peninsula. Cape York Peninsula is an untouched wilderness on the northern tip of Australia and is home to about 18,000 people, most of which are Aboriginal tribes that are native. There is a road, but it's unpaved, and flooding in the area makes the road inaccessible for most of the time. And that may be because Cape York Peninsula is dead in the middle of monsoon season much of the year, which makes the weather kind of volatile and traffic kind of difficult. The best way to actually reach this untouched wilderness is by helicopter. And as far as remote goes, there's the Kerguelen Islands. The Kerguelen Islands probably have most places on Earth beat because they're commonly known as the Desolation Islands due to their sheer distance from any kind of civilization. There's no airstrip on the island, so any visitor that comes there has to take a 6-day boat ride from a smaller island located off the coast of Madagascar. But what's actually located there? Well, primarily it's a scientific research center. But moreover, it's also the home to a French missile defense system, a satellite, and a refuge for French cattle populations that are endangered on the mainland. Now, it may surprise you to know that many islands are actually inaccessible by air, and Bouvet Island is something special. With its nearest neighbor being Antarctica, 1,000 miles to the south, Bouvet Island really is in the middle of nowhere. It has no airstrip, and like its friend the Kerguelen Islands, it requires travelers to take a 10-day boat ride from a shipping boat from New Zealand. Although very remote, Bouvet Island does still have its own internet country code, though it's never been used because the island doesn't have any permanent inhabitants. However, with no airstrip, they still managed to film the 2004 Alien vs. Predator movie on the island, and that's quite a feat within itself. Perhaps no one would believe that the continental United States would make the list for remote places, but at the bottom of the Grand Canyon lies Supai, Arizona. This town is home to 500 residents, but according to the 2000 US Census, the population was actually 0. That's right, the town is so remote in fact that they missed it altogether. Supai makes the only place in the United States where the daily mail is still delivered by donkey, and there are no roads that lead into it because it's all about the hike down the Grand Canyon. Socotra Island made the list not because of inaccessibility, but because of the alien-looking wildlife that inhabits the island. Socotra Island's wildlife has given it the title of the most alien-looking place on Earth. It's been said that over 1/3 of the island's wildlife actually can't be found anywhere else in the world, and some of it even looks like it's defying gravity. Ironically, about 40,000 people do inhabit the island, and they have plenty of ways to get around. It features 2 roads, an airstrip with flights leaving every day, and you can even rent a car. However, don't be fooled though. Socotra Island is way far out there, and it might make you feel like you've even left Earth. Tristan da Cunha is another island that sits in the middle of nowhere. Located roughly 1,700 miles from the nearest landmass, being South Africa, the island's total population is just under 300 people, consisting mostly of fishermen and craftsmen. The only visitors to the island are deep-sea fishing boats. That was after the British transport boat that once connected the island with South Africa interrupted the service. The island's only reachable by boat as the terrain is way too rocky to build an airstrip. It does, however, have internet access and a few television stations thanks to the satellite that was put in, but still remains one of the most physically isolated places on Earth. In the middle of the Karakum Desert is a fire pit that's commonly referred to as the doorway to hell. This phenomenon has been burning since 1971, when geologists would accidentally create a massive crater. Soviets believed that it contains a massive oil field and then began drilling, when something went terribly wrong. The ground would then collapse and create a massive outpouring of methane gas that threatened a nearby village. And then to solve the problem, the scientists simply lit the crater on fire in order to burn away the gas, expecting it to burn out in a few days. Now, it's 40 years later and it's still raging, making it one of the most bizarre places on Earth. Moving on to Greece, we find the Meteora Monastery. The monastery is another one of those holy places that's been built in a bizarre location. This Meteora Monastery is built on a massive rock pillar, and the name serves the place well because Meteora actually means suspended in the air. Held high in the sky, the more than 20 monks and nuns that call the monastery home built it in its location in order to be protected from trespassers and previously found solitudes in elevation. But recently, their solitude hasn't exactly been very well respected. As it turns out, the monastery has become something of a tourist attraction, and everyone travels there to try and get the picturesque views after having been featured in the television series Game of Thrones. Easter Island is one of those very commonly known about attractions. However, not many people know exactly how isolated it is. The only way to reach the island is from a long flight that comes out of Chile, and that's because it's its nearest landmass. And even so, it's still more than 2,300 miles away. The largest village on the island holds home to about 3,300 people who survive mostly off of tourism, and the island itself is covered in enormous rock heads that were built thousands of years ago. Even scientists aren't exactly sure how they got there. Though the heads are famous, many people don't know that the island is actually home to volcanoes and caverns that are quite extensive. And all of that put together makes Easter Island all the more interesting. Ayers Rock takes the title of largest monolith in the world, and it's also called Uluru. This massive rock is sacred to the Aboriginal tribes that inhabit the area, and it's home to many watering holes and ancient paintings, which of course adds to the site and contributes to its beautiful character. The nearest town is more than 280 miles away, but it isn't as isolated as some of the other places on our list. As it turns out, you can actually drive to this site, which is a luxury within its own self, and we're now learning is pretty rare. Gasadalur Village on the Faroe Islands is one of the most isolated villages in the world and is on one of the most isolated islands in the world. Gasadalur Village is home to 18 people, and that's a gain of 2 from the 2002 census in which the population was 16. There is a hope that the village population will actually increase, as they recently just blasted a tunnel through the mountains in order to connect the village to others, and hopefully it all works out for them. Salar de Uyuni. Now, just imagine yourself standing on miles and miles of flat, dry, dusty land with little to no wildlife. Well, that's exactly what you'll find in Bolivia at Salar de Uyuni, because it's the largest salt flat in the world. And it's more than 4,000 square miles, sitting at more than 12,000 feet above sea level, hosting only pink flamingos and migratory birds. Scientists believe that the flat was created when a prehistoric lake dried up, leaving piles of salt and the occasional seasonal puddle. However, here's a fun fact about the salt flat. About 50% of the world's lithium supply that's used in cell phones and batteries actually comes from under this area, which is a large contribution. Rounding out our list of bizarre isolated places is Majlis al-Jinn, a cave in Oman. The cave is only accessible by scaling down from holes in the ceiling from the desert above. Until recently, there were no paths to the cave, with climbers having to hike with all of their equipment for at least a couple of hours before dropping over 150 meters into the cave below. This cave eventually became popular with base jumpers, with how adrenaline pumping the drop is, and climbers and even base jumpers can now take a four-wheel drive vehicle through the desert just to get to the cave in order to see this amazing sight. There are many vacation spots to visit. Somewhere warm, somewhere cold, or somewhere with corpses. In these modern times, we bury our dead or cremate them. What we don't do, generally, is build catacombs using their skulls, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened in our history. On the other hand, sometimes corpses are found in mass in one place, for whatever reason.